All right. Well, thank you for the songs this morning. We'll be returning to Isaiah chapter 14 as we continue our study through the book of Isaiah. This is now message number 22, entitled The Unseen Hand. And we're going to be looking at the rest of this chapter. So that's verses 24 to 32. And I'll read 24 through 27 as we get started. The Lord of hosts hath sworn, saying, Surely as I have thought, so shall it come to pass, and as I have purposed, so shall it stand, that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and upon my mountains tread him under foot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. This is the purpose that is purposed upon the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out upon all the nations. For the Lord of hosts hath purposed, and who shall disannul it? And his hand is stretched out, and who shall turn it back? So, chapter 4 continued the oracle judgment against Babylon with the proverb or the song of Babylon's fall. And the downfall of this historically great Babylon will involve the death of the king, the Antichrist, and also the binding of Satan, whose power gives rise to the final Babylonian king, and the beast in the time of tribulation. So the chapter began with a brief assurance of the restoration of Israel as God's chosen nation, where they will be united as the house of Jacob and possess the land promised to Abraham. And the song is a song that is mocking the fall of Babylon, is rejoicing at the fall of Babylon, and in fact, it's a rejoicing of the whole earth, not just a few, and a time of peace in that future kingdom. And again, you can look through this chapter and certainly see that these things have not been fulfilled historically, although we have some aspects that were. The Medes really did overthrow the Babylonians, and that did really take place. And the overthrow of Assyria, just like we'll see in the coming chapter, referring to Sennacherib's defeat there at Jerusalem. I mean, like, these things really did happen historically, but we find that there are other elements as well in this prophecy that have not been fulfilled historically. And we've seen a great example just through studying Isaiah of how that in prophecy, oftentimes there are things that are more immediate, there's things that are far future, and there's no real indication that these events are separated by a gap of time, but it's very common. We've encountered it numerous times already, and we're only in the 14th chapter of Isaiah. So that is, we have another example of that in the beginning of chapter 14. Now, as we get to the last part of chapter 14, we switch from Babylon, and now we have these oracles against Assyria and Philistia. This passage, which isn't very long here, but this passage speaks very strongly in terms of God's sovereignty regarding what is pronounced upon those nations. And so the unfolding of all of these events, it is emphasized here how that these things are all according to God's purpose. And really, that's what you have to have if prophecy is going to be fulfilled. You have to have the sovereignty of God, who is not only purposing and planning these things, but is also governing these things and these events so that they all do come about and fulfill the word that he has spoken. Now, the word against Assyria, as we said, looks forward to that defeat of Sennacherib in particular at Jerusalem during the reign of Hezekiah. And then the word to Philistia comes as a warning for them not to rejoice too much at the fall of Assyria. Not to, in other words, it's a warning that essentially says, don't think that you will now rise and take over. because this threat has been removed. So it's a word of warning as well. So we'll look at each of these parts. So in verses 24 to 27 is where we have the word against Assyria. And in verses 28 to 32 is where we have the word against Philistia. So we will start with the first part and that word against Assyria, beginning again with verse number 24. The Lord of hosts hath sworn, saying, surely as I have thought, so shall it come to pass, and as I have purposed, so shall it stand. Now, these verses 24 to 27, that speak against Assyria, they come after this burden of Babylon, after the woe that was pronounced to Babylon, as it were, and they serve as something of an encouragement because when you think about the timing of this is after, most likely after the carrying away of the northern kingdom. They're already suffering in captivity to the Assyrians. But here's a word that continues to speak to God's purpose. And by the time that Judah was carried away into Babylon, this word against the Assyrians would have been fulfilled. So there was confirmation to them. There was affirming of those things that were spoken, and again encouraging their faith to believe in the promises that have been made to them. Now, this section heavily emphasizes this sovereign, supreme purpose of God. In other words, it's presented to us here in terms of what is set, what has been determined, what is going to come to pass, and there's none that can prevent it. There's none that can change it. There's none that can sort of steer it another way. It's going to come to pass, and it can't be undone. So notice in the verse number 24, the Lord of hosts, and we've seen this title, the Yahweh of Sabaoth, of the armies, which again is often here we've seen associated with that coming judgment. But it says that he has sworn. In other words, he has sworn. He has sworn an oath saying, surely as I have thought, so shall it come to pass, and as I have purposed, so shall it stand. Now, we've studied this somewhat when we were looking at the biblical covenants and in some other places as well. And there's no, God doesn't have to swear in order for his word to be more firm or more secure. But he does that, as we recently learned going through Hebrews, is that he does that for our benefit. He does that for our good, for our understanding that this is a fixed and decreed word. This is going to come to pass without fail, without change, without any hindrance at all. So we're told here in verse 24 in particular that the purpose of God will stand. It can't be overcome, meaning that everything that God has purposed will come to pass. Now, some of those things God reveals to us, and some of those he doesn't. There are many things that we don't know of what God has purposed, and but we do know that everything God has purposed will come to pass. And now, again, that word of encouragement would come that we ought not to grow weary. We ought not to faint, that even down to us today. And there are many things that we can be perpetually distressed about in the world around us and in our country and all over the world. There's so many things that we can be constantly distressed about. But ultimately, we have this same sort of assurance as what's being spoken to Israel and Judah here, that all these times are in God's hands. We may not know or understand or be able to see the purpose and how things are connected together and how the things are going to turn out necessarily, but they are in his hands. And so as we look back throughout history, we find prophecies fulfilled. And that should urge us and sort of motivate us and just move us along in faith for those things that are yet to be fulfilled. All will come to pass. Now let's get more particular into God's purpose for Assyria, beginning there with verse 25. That I will break the Assyrian in my land, and upon my mountains tread him underfoot. Then shall his yoke depart from off them, and his burden depart from off their shoulders. This is the purpose that is purposed upon the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out upon all the nations. For the Lord of hosts hath purposed, and who shall disannul it? And his hand is stretched out, and who shall turn it back? Now, verse 25 in particular speaks of the Assyrians and God's purpose against Assyria. Now, we've already seen previously how that God said that he had used Assyria as a rod in his hand, as an instrument of punishment against Israel and Judah both, but that Assyria's time was very limited and that God was going to judge the Assyrians. So his purpose against Assyria that we see particularly in verse 25 is going to be fulfilled. Now, this was spoken at a time when Assyria was at the height of its power. And so Assyria had for a few centuries been in power, and they seemed invincible. They seemed unopposable. Many of these other nations were scrambling, and that's why these different alliances were springing up between nations here and there, alliances of convenience to try to fend off this threat from Assyria. But we're told this is God's purpose, and he's going to essentially tread them underfoot on his mountains. And we'll see that literally fulfilled when Sennacherib leads his forces against Jerusalem, and they surround Jerusalem, and the angel of the Lord goes through the camp and kills 185,000 of the Assyrian army at that time. But there's something else that we need to notice as well, and that's in verses 26 to 27, because they sort of circle back around, in a sense, to verse 24, how that all God's purposes will stand. So notice that this statement that's being made is very broad. It's not just what God has purposed against the Assyrians will stand. This says, we're told this is his purpose upon all the earth. This is his purpose upon all the nations. His hand is stretched out over them all. Now, just with the Assyrians, we are told what is going to happen to them. And so we know what is going to happen to them. But essentially, we're being told that this is God's purpose as well against all the nations of the earth who dwell in wicked unbelief. And we can understand their fate is going to be very similar. Now, we do see in verses 26 to 27 this focus on God's purpose and here on his power to perform. Now, we all know that we can have we make plans all the time, and we have a purpose that we want to accomplish, and we know a lot of times that there are many different factors that are at play, whether or not those plans are fulfilled. And sometimes things we don't even think about or don't even consider will affect those plans and will, essentially just tank them and leave them unfulfilled. But it's not the case. It's not the case with God's purpose. First of all, of course, God knows all things, and so there's nothing unexpected that can arise and upset God's plan or cause some change in his plan. And he also has the power to do what he has purposed to do. So he cannot be hindered. He cannot be successfully opposed. He cannot be changed. And this purpose, again, is upon the whole earth and upon all the nations. So what that speaks to is the fact that God's will is comprehensive. God's will is comprehensive. It includes all this universe and all the beings and creatures and aspects of creation in it. It includes everything that is in it. That God's will, God's purpose is comprehensive of all of these things that he has made. And so there is this unseen hand that is over all of creation, guiding and governing what comes to pass. Now, the arrangement of these oracles in Isaiah's prophecy, these oracles of judgment, begins with Babylon and then begins to address several other nations, and of course looks forward to that final coalition of nations aligned against Jerusalem that will be destroyed by the Lord. But it also speaks to Israel in another way. When you think about woes to Babylon and then Assyria and then the other nations that begin to follow, one of the messages to Israel is that there's always going to be another nation. They're in undergoing long exile judgment. There's always going to be another enemy. And maybe one is defeated and one is removed. And then there'll just be another to take its place. And this is just going to go on and on and on and on until the time of their repentance, which we know will not happen until the coming of the Lord. Now, the second part of this is the word against Philistia that begins here with verse number 28. In the year that King Ahaz died was this burden. Now, in this section of woes, we're now encountering a definite time, sort of a definite time marker. It's not entirely certain. The exact year of Ahaz's death is not entirely certain. Somewhere around 716, 715 BC that this would be spoken. And so he proceeds, verse 29, rejoice not thou, whole Palestina, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. For out of the serpent's root shall come forth a cockatrice, and his fruit shall be a fiery, flying serpent. So this burden speaks against the Philistines, and that word there for Palestina is referring to Syria, Palestina, what we also know as Philistia. It refers to the region that is on the west coast part of the land of Canaan. And the precise origin of the Philistines is kind of uncertain. There are references from ancient Egypt that referred to them as a part of the sea peoples. So it is believed that they were a part of not necessarily native to that area, but migrants to that area. Amos chapter 9, verse 7. Jeremiah chapter 47, verse 4 suggests that they were a migrant people. And we can find them as far back as Genesis chapter 21 in the days of Abraham. Though they seem to be somewhat friendly with Abraham and such at that time, we know that by the time of the Judges, when they had come back into the land of Canaan out of Egypt, they were enemies to Israel. So we read about the Philistines, particularly in Judges 13 to 16, somewhere in there. Now, the Philistine nation, and this is why you see the whole Palestina that is referred to, the nation consisted primarily of 5 different city-states in this region, Ashdod, Gaza, Askelon, Gath, and Ekron. And each of those city-states had their own ruler or their own lord, as it were. And this is why you see here and then later, again, they'll be addressed as all of Philistia, essentially. And the tensions between the Philistines and Israel continued from that time of the Judges through the days of Samuel and really even into the days of David in particular. That finally, during the reign of David, he had fully defeated the Philistines by 2 Samuel chapter 5. And from that point forward, the Philistines sort of went back and forth. They went back and forth between being in subjection to Judah and being in rebellion against them. And so they were in rebellion at the time that this word was given, this during the reign of King Ahaz. So obviously relations between them and Israel and Judah was not good. So we go on reading here in verse number 29, rejoice not thou, whole Palestina, because the rod of him that smote thee is broken. For out of the serpent's root shall come forth a cockatrice, and his fruit shall be a flying serpent. And continuing on here, and the firstborn of the poor shall feed, and the needy shall lie down in safety. And I will kill thy root with famine, and he shall slay thy remnant. Howl, O gate, cry, O city, thou whole Palestina art dissolved. For there shall come forth from the north a smoke, and none shall be alone in his appointed time. What shall one then answer the messengers of the nation? That the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it. So he speaks of this rod being broken, and he is, and again, this is a word that is telling those of the Philistines not to rejoice too greatly. This rod points to Assyria, and Assyria being broken. So this would also be a warning that would speak against any sort of alliance with the Philistines and thinking of anything that way. And you see this succession in verse 29. Don't rejoice because this rod was broken, for out of the serpent's root will come the cockatrice, and from there a fiery flying serpent. In other words, those snakes, so to speak, become increasingly worse, increasingly more dangerous by degrees when you proceed through there. And it paints a picture of just a continued opposition and enemy aggression. So Israel will not be safe because Assyria has fallen, and their enemies will continue, as we mentioned earlier. Now, we also read the conditions that will be: the firstborn of the poor shall feed, and the needy shall lie down in safety, and so on. In other words, we get a description that in Zion there will be deliverance. In Zion there will be safety. In other words, there will be a remnant that will be preserved. And as we look forward to the far future, into like Revelation chapter 14, we see that remnant being preserved from the Antichrist in that day. But we also get a contrast here between the care that God takes of his faithful to the judgment of destruction upon the Philistines, that particularly described in verse 31. And so the whole effect of this passage shows Israel that being under judgment means that their enemies will continue. One will fall, another will rise to take their place. And so the prophet points them beyond all these earthly powers to their only true hope and salvation, which is the coming Messiah King. Now, particularly we see emphasized in this part of the chapter, as we mentioned earlier, the sovereignty of God and his purpose over all of his creation, and particularly over all these nations of the earth. And the story of the nations in the Bible is mostly an account of rebellions against God and persecution of his chosen nation. Now, the rebellion of the nations continues, obviously, to this day, and will continue until Jesus Christ comes to put an end to all their rebellions. And so this sort of unfolding throughout history is spoken of, like in Daniel chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar's dream and that great statue and how it represented all these nations progressing throughout history. The prophet Haggai prophesied of a time coming when God will shake the nations in judgment. So Haggai chapter 2, verses 6 and 7, for thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once it is a liable while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. So the course of history, as it were, and we're in that stage of that long exile, and so Israel still remains primarily scattered among the nations. And the course of that history is God's purpose for those nations, and particularly an emphasis of judgment that is coming upon them. Now, this in particular refers to the time of tribulation that's prophesied in the Old Testament. It's detailed in Revelation chapters 6 through 19. And in that time, the nations will in fact be united under that leader, under that last king of Babylon that we read about in the earlier part of this chapter, the one known by various different names in prophecy, the prince that shall come in Daniel 9:26, the king of fierce countenance in Daniel 8:23, the man of sin, the son of perdition, 2 Thessalonians 2:3, the Antichrist, 1 John 2:18, the beast from the bottomless pit in Revelation 11:7 as well. And we learn that he will lead a war on Israel. He will lead a war against the Lamb of God with all of these nations. Revelation 17, verses 13 to 15. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. These shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. And he saith unto me, the waters which thou sawest, where the horse sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And of course, this war that's described here will end in the Battle of Armageddon when Jesus returns to the earth in Revelation chapter 19. And then after this will occur the judgment of the nations in Matthew 25. And so I'm just rehearsing some of God's purpose for the nations that we do know, that has been revealed to us in the Bible. And those unbelieving of the nations will be cast into hell. And those that are believing will enter into the millennial kingdom. And then, of course, Satan will be bound for 1,000 years, will not be able to deceive the nations, to lead them against Israel and against Christ. But then he will be loosed for a little season, and he will lead a final rebellion of the nations at the end of that millennium, and he will be finally defeated. We read in Revelation chapter 20, verses 7 to 10, and when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison, and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth and compassed the camp of the saints about in the beloved city. And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. And then we have the great white throne judgment that takes place, and after that, the eternal age in the new heaven and the new earth. But here's what is important to see and to realize. Again, the history of the nations in the Bible is primarily a history of their rebellions against God and pronouncements of judgment against them. And it might seem like that's the end of the story. That, well, at this point, God's made an end to the nations, right? But no. Those of the nations will go on to inherit territorial possessions for eternity, bring their tribute into the New Jerusalem. And you can read about that in Revelation 21, verses 23 to 27. It's the eternal ages, and nations still bringing their glory into New Jerusalem. So the story of the nations is the account of God's purpose. And so God has purposed for the human race to be grouped in diverse ethnic groups, to be entailed with land territories that will be redeemed to glorify God as nations for eternity. Now, throughout history, nations come and nations go. And of course, there's a time that probably all nations reach. They have a peak of their power and of their greatness, and probably all nations feel like we are it and we will last forever. But that really is not the case. We'll go on to see in Isaiah how nations are just a drop in the bucket to God. It's His purpose that rules over all. So nations come and go according to God's purpose. And no nation should ever boast in anything apart from God and apart from His grace and apart from His will and purpose. All right, we'll stop here, and we will close with a hymn.
Okay, we'll close with My Jesus, I Love Thee.